The airport was already crowded long before the first rays of sunlight fully reached the large glass windows. Travelers moved quickly through the bright terminal halls, some pulling suitcases behind them, others holding coffee cups while checking their boarding passes again and again. Announcements echoed through the building every few minutes, calling passengers to different gates. At gate 27, people were gathering for a long international flight. Most of them looked tired from early morning travel, while others seemed excited about the journey ahead. Some passengers wore expensive suits, clearly heading to business meetings in another country. A few families tried to keep their children calm while waiting for boarding to begin. Among the crowd sat a woman who didn't draw much attention at first. She was dressed simply. A dark jacket, comfortable shoes, and a small carry-on bag rested beside her chair. Her posture was relaxed, and she watched the activity around her with quiet patience. Every now and then she checked the time on her phone, then looked back toward the large window where the airplane waited outside. The aircraft looked huge compared to the people walking around it on the ground. Workers moved luggage carts and prepared the plane for departure. The woman observed everything calmly, almost thoughtfully, as if she had seen this routine many times before. Around her, several passengers spoke loudly about business deals and investments. One man bragged about a meeting he was planning overseas. Another traveler talked about how often he flew first class and how exhausting long flights could be. The woman said nothing. She simply listened. A few minutes later, the boarding announcement finally came. Passengers began lining up according to their boarding groups. First class was invited to board first, and several well-dressed travelers stepped forward confidently. Some carried expensive briefcases. Others walked with the relaxed attitude of people who were used to luxury travel. The woman stood up quietly and joined the same line. For a brief moment, the man standing behind her looked slightly surprised. His eyes moved from her simple travel bag to the sign that read, "First class boarding." He didn't say anything, but his expression showed clear curiosity. The line moved slowly as the airline staff scanned each boarding pass. When it was her turn, the woman handed her pass to the agent with a polite smile. The agent scanned it and immediately saw the seat number. First class. The agent returned the ticket and wished her a pleasant flight. The woman thanked her softly and walked down the long jet bridge toward the airplane. Inside the aircraft, the cabin lighting was warm and calm. The first class section looked comfortable, with large seats and wide spaces between them. Some passengers had already settled in and were placing their bags in the overhead compartments. A flight attendant greeted passengers near the entrance with a professional smile. "Welcome aboard," she said to each traveler. When the woman stepped into the cabin, the attendant greeted her politely, though her eyes quickly scanned the woman's simple clothing before looking at the boarding pass. "Good morning," the attendant said. "May I see your seat number?" The woman handed over the pass. The attendant looked at it for a second, then pointed toward a seat near the window. "Right this way," she said. The woman thanked her and placed her bag in the overhead bin before sitting down. The seat was comfortable, and the wide window beside her showed the busy airport outside. Workers moved equipment across the runway while the sun slowly brightened the sky. One by one, the other first-class passengers took their seats. Some nodded politely to each other. Others immediately opened laptops or began checking emails. A few started conversations about business or travel plans. Not far away, two men were discussing the stock market. Another passenger was already speaking on his phone, telling someone he would land in time for an important meeting. The woman listened quietly while fastening her seatbelt. Soon the flight attendants began preparing the cabin for departure. One attendant rolled a small cart down the aisle with glasses of champagne for the first-class passengers. It was a common welcome service for this type of flight. She stopped at the first row and handed a glass to a smiling couple. "Welcome aboard," she said warmly. Then she moved to the next seat, offering another glass. Passenger after passenger accepted the drink with casual confidence, some thanking her politely, while others barely looked up from their phones. The cart slowly moved closer to the woman's seat. As the attendant approached, her smile remained polite, but there was a slight hesitation in her movement. She glanced briefly at the woman, then looked toward the tray of glasses. Instead of offering one right away, she paused. "Hello," the attendant said. "Are you comfortable here?" The woman looked up calmly. "Yes, thank you," she replied. The attendant nodded but didn't immediately offer the champagne like she had to everyone else. For a second, it almost seemed like she might continue moving the cart forward. Then she spoke again. "Would you like something else instead? Maybe water or juice?" The woman noticed the question immediately. She had watched the attendant offer champagne to every passenger before her. But her voice remained calm. "Champagne would be fine," she said politely. The attendant blinked slightly, then quickly picked up a glass from the tray. "Of course," she said, handing it over. The woman accepted it with a small smile. "Thank you." The interaction lasted only a few seconds, but a man sitting across the aisle had quietly noticed everything. He had seen the moment of hesitation. He had heard the different question, and he raised his eyebrows slightly before looking back at his tablet. The woman, however, showed no sign of discomfort. She simply placed the glass on the small table beside her seat and looked out the window again. Outside, the airport was now fully awake. Planes moved slowly across the runway, preparing for their own departures. Inside the cabin, passengers continued their conversations. One person laughed loudly at a joke. Another asked a flight attendant for extra pillows. The cabin slowly filled with the quiet sounds of travel preparation. A few minutes later, another attendant walked through the aisle checking seatbelts and making sure all bags were properly stored. When she reached the woman's seat, she glanced briefly at her and nodded politely before moving on. The woman remained calm, almost thoughtful. If the earlier moment had bothered her, she didn't show it. Instead, she picked up a small notebook from her bag and began writing something. Her handwriting was neat and careful. Every few lines she paused, thinking before continuing again. The man across the aisle noticed this as well. He leaned slightly toward her after a moment. "Heading somewhere for business?" he asked with a friendly tone. She looked up and smiled politely. "Yes," she said. "Long trip. Just a meeting." He nodded. "Same here. Seems like half the plane is flying to meetings these days." She gave a small laugh. "That's probably true." The man extended his hand slightly. "I travel this route a lot," he said. "It's a long flight, but first class makes it easier." She shook his hand politely. "I'm sure it does." Their conversation stayed light and brief. The man talked a little about the company he worked for and how often he traveled internationally. The woman listened respectfully but didn't say much about herself. If anything, she seemed more interested in observing the world around her than talking about her own work. Soon the cabin doors closed. The flight attendants performed the safety demonstration while passengers settled into their seats. Outside the window, the plane slowly began to move away from the gate. The engines hummed softly as the aircraft prepared for takeoff. Inside the quiet first-class cabin, everything appeared normal. But the small moment earlier, the hesitation, the different question, the slightly uncertain tone, still lingered quietly in the background. The woman didn't complain. She didn't mention it. She simply sat calmly in her seat, looking out at the runway as the plane moved forward. None of the passengers around her knew that the quiet traveler beside the window carried a story far bigger than anyone on that flight could imagine. And before the journey was over, several people on that plane would realize just how wrong their first assumptions had been. The plane had taken off smoothly, and the first-class cabin settled into the quiet hum of the engines. Soft lighting made the seats and tables look even more comfortable than they had at the gate. Some passengers were already leaning back, closing their eyes to rest, while others pulled out laptops or phones to catch up on work before reaching their destination. The woman near the window remained calm, sitting upright but relaxed. She picked up the glass of champagne the attendant had finally offered and examined it quietly. She swirled it gently, watching the bubbles rise. There was a sense of patience in her movements, a quiet observation of the world around her rather than rushing to drink or to start a conversation. Across the aisle, the businessman she had briefly spoken to earlier glanced at her occasionally. He noticed how calm she seemed, as though nothing could disturb her. He felt a strange curiosity about her. Most travelers in first class carried themselves with pride or urgency, but she did not. He couldn't place why, but something about her quiet demeanor made him pay attention. He thought about introducing himself more formally, but he hesitated. She seemed like someone who didn't need to be impressed by anyone. As the flight attendants began serving meals, the woman watched how they moved through the cabin. She noticed the small differences in how they treated passengers. Some were quick to offer refills, ask questions politely, and smile warmly. Others seemed rushed, speaking in short sentences without much attention to the person they served. She observed all this with a careful eye, taking mental notes about human behavior. She didn't judge them harshly. She simply saw it the way a person might watch a scene in a play or a story unfolding. Soon the beverage cart approached again. Champagne glasses glinted in the soft cabin light. Passengers reached eagerly, chatting with attendants or thanking them politely. When the cart came closer to her seat, the attendant paused slightly. This hesitation was subtle but noticeable. Instead of automatically offering the drink, the attendant seemed to consider something, looking at her carefully. "Would you like some more champagne? Or perhaps water?" The attendant asked politely, her tone almost uncertain this time. The woman smiled lightly and replied, "Champagne, please." Her voice was calm, even, and soft. She accepted the glass when it was handed to her without a hint of irritation or anger. It was a simple act, but it spoke volumes about her confidence and patience. She did not demand special treatment, nor did she appear upset at being questioned differently than others. A few seats down, another passenger noticed the small interaction. He was an older woman traveling alone, dressed neatly but modestly. She had seen similar moments happen before on flights and quietly shook her head, muttering under her breath about assumptions people make based on appearances. The older woman's gaze lingered on the quiet traveler, a mixture of curiosity and admiration forming in her expression. The businessman across the aisle couldn't help himself. He leaned slightly forward, asking, "Do you travel often?" "Yes," she replied softly. "Work requires it sometimes." He nodded, trying to hide his surprise. There was something about the simplicity of her answer that didn't match the confidence she seemed to carry. Most people in first class would either boast about their travel frequency or start talking about business ventures. But she spoke simply, without pretense. The conversation drifted for a moment. Then the man returned to his tablet. He was curious but also respectful, sensing that this was not the kind of person who wanted attention or flattery. The woman picked up her notebook and began writing again, her handwriting neat and careful. Occasionally she paused, glancing out the window as if thinking about something larger than the flight itself. The flight attendants continued their rounds. One of them noticed the way she had accepted the champagne with grace and how composed she remained. There was a sense of realization among the crew that this passenger was not like most others. She carried herself with a quiet dignity, and the small difference in treatment earlier now seemed almost embarrassing to the attendants who had hesitated. Meanwhile, the hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glasses created a calm atmosphere. Some passengers were sleeping, some were talking quietly, and some were working. The cabin felt like a small world of its own, each person wrapped in their own story, yet subtly observing each other. The woman took a small sip of champagne and then set it aside, picking up her notebook again. She wrote something down, then paused and looked out the window. Below, the landscape moved steadily, clouds floating over rivers and fields. The sunlight made everything shimmer. There was a sense of perspective in her gaze, as if she were not just seeing the flight or the plane, but the larger world below and beyond. The businessman, noticing her gaze, asked gently, "Thinking about work?" She smiled faintly. "Not exactly. Just observing." He nodded. "I see. Some people notice details others miss." "Yes," she said simply. "Details matter." There was a pause in the conversation, comfortable and unforced. The flight attendants, moving down the aisle again, glanced at her with more attention now. They were polite, efficient, and careful not to make the same mistake of hesitation. It was clear they now recognized her presence as important, even if they didn't yet know exactly why. She did not show any change in demeanor. She remained calm, quiet, and focused on small things: the notebook, the landscape, the soft hum of the airplane. A few passengers began noticing subtle signs as well. They saw the respect growing among the crew. They noticed how other travelers occasionally glanced at her, sensing something remarkable but undefined. Some passengers whispered to each other quietly, speculating about who she might be, though no one dared to ask her directly. The woman's calm observation extended beyond the crew. She noticed how some passengers treated the attendants with kindness, while others barely acknowledged them. The small details of human behavior fascinated her. She was learning about people without judging, quietly noting actions and reactions, listening to conversations, and paying attention to facial expressions. Hours passed. The flight continued smoothly over cities, rivers, and mountains. Meal service came and went, and the woman's quiet presence remained steady. Occasionally, the businessman across the aisle asked simple questions, and she responded politely, always choosing words carefully. Her modesty and calmness stood out even more as time went on, making her appear unassuming yet remarkably composed. The cabin settled into a rhythm. Some passengers slept, some watched movies, and some worked. The woman, however, kept her notebook close. She wrote down observations, details, and reflections. Occasionally she glanced around, making brief eye contact with crew members who now moved with more confidence and care, no longer uncertain about her presence. The older woman sitting a few seats away kept glancing at her. There was a quiet respect forming. She noticed the way the woman handled herself, the patience she displayed, and the calm grace she carried in a busy, crowded cabin. Even the businessman across the aisle began to see her differently. He had initially thought she was just another passenger, quiet and unassuming. Now, he sensed that there was much more beneath her calm exterior. She carried herself with dignity, not demanding attention but commanding it quietly through presence and observation. When the flight attendants came through with a final round of drinks before settling in for the long journey, the woman accepted a simple water. She smiled at the attendant and thanked her softly. The attendant returned the smile, now understanding that the earlier hesitation was unnecessary. She moved on, careful to treat every interaction with attention and respect. Throughout the cabin, the atmosphere felt subtly different. Passengers who had been distracted by their own devices or conversations now found themselves quietly noticing details. How people spoke, how they treated others, and how simple gestures could reveal character. The woman remained calm by the window, occasionally sipping her water, occasionally writing in her notebook, occasionally glancing at the clouds below. She seemed fully present, fully aware of the space around her, yet undisturbed by it. She did not boast, complain, or seek attention. She simply observed, quietly and gracefully, making the ordinary moments of a long flight feel meaningful. And while she appeared to blend into the world around her, the small moments of observation and interaction were already planting seeds of recognition among the crew and nearby passengers. They would remember her calmness, her patience, and her quiet confidence long after the flight landed. The hours passed with a gentle rhythm, the plane cutting smoothly through the sky. Outside, the world moved below in rivers, cities, and fields. Inside, the cabin moved in its own rhythm, passengers adjusting, eating, resting, and observing each other. And amid it all, the woman by the window remained quietly remarkable. Her presence was unassuming yet magnetic, and her calm observation was a lesson in dignity and patience for everyone who noticed. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for rest, it was clear that she had already left a subtle impression on those around her. Some would talk about her afterward in quiet conversation. Some would reflect on her patience and composure. Others would simply remember the quiet moment when someone so simple in appearance carried herself with quiet strength. And so the flight continued, carrying the passengers across skies and continents, with one quiet observer by the window who saw more than most and left impressions deeper than anyone could have guessed. Her calm presence had already begun to shape the experience of the flight for everyone around her, even before the bigger story behind her identity had come to light. Hours passed on the flight, and the soft hum of the engines filled the first-class cabin. Most passengers had settled into their routines. Some had fallen asleep with blankets draped over them. Others quietly watched movies or read books, and a few tapped away on laptops, sending messages or completing work before landing. The cabin was calm, the dimmed lights making the atmosphere serene. The woman by the window remained composed, her notebook open on the tray table. She occasionally paused to gaze out at the clouds, then wrote something down, her pen moving smoothly across the page. Every now and then, she looked around the cabin, observing the small interactions happening in her space. She did not comment or interfere, only noted and quietly reflected. Meanwhile, the flight attendants had completed the main meal service and moved on to checking if any passenger needed additional drinks or assistance. One of the attendants, a senior crew member, paused near the woman's seat. She remembered the earlier hesitation when offering champagne and had replayed the moment in her mind several times. She was curious about this passenger, who had remained so calm and unassuming throughout the flight. "Excuse me," the attendant said softly, leaning slightly toward the woman. "Is everything comfortable so far?" The woman looked up, smiling gently. "Yes, thank you. Everything is fine." The attendant nodded, and for a moment, hesitated. There was something about the calmness and quiet dignity of this passenger that made the crew member feel she needed to be more attentive than usual. She moved along the aisle, speaking to other passengers, but her mind remained partially on the woman by the window. Nearby, a businessman who had previously exchanged a few words with her leaned back and observed her more closely. Something in the way she carried herself felt familiar in a way he could not place. She was polite, understated, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she moved, the way she interacted with the crew, and the way she observed the cabin. It was unlike any passenger he had encountered before. He leaned slightly forward, as if to ask her another question, but stopped himself. She seemed private, careful about revealing too much. Instead, he watched quietly, noticing the subtle signs of her composure and the understated authority in her manner. Meanwhile, the senior attendant had discreetly accessed the airline's passenger information system on her tablet. Her curiosity had grown too strong to ignore. She typed the passenger's name and quickly realized something astonishing. The quiet woman in the seat near the window was not just another traveler. She was the chief executive officer of a major international company, one of the airline's largest corporate clients. Her company had business contracts worth millions each year, including frequent travel arrangements for employees and partners. The realization hit the attendant immediately. She replayed the earlier hesitation in her mind. She thought about how she had questioned whether the woman wanted champagne and had offered something simpler instead. A sudden wave of embarrassment and regret washed over her. Other crew members began to notice her reaction and, one by one, looked at the passenger list. As the information spread quietly among the attendants, there was a growing sense of awareness in the cabin. This was not just any passenger. This was someone whose name carried significant weight in the corporate world. The flight attendants adjusted their approach immediately. They moved with more confidence, attending carefully to each passenger, but giving special attention to the woman by the window. Whenever they passed her seat, they made eye contact and offered polite assistance, ensuring she had everything she needed. Despite the sudden shift in attention from the crew, the woman remained composed. She did not display any sign that she knew what the attendants had discovered. She smiled politely when they offered assistance, thanked them softly, and returned to writing in her notebook. There was no sense of superiority, no demand for special treatment, only calm patience and quiet grace. Passengers around her began to notice a subtle change in the service. Drinks were offered more promptly, smiles were warmer, and the attendants moved with a visible attentiveness that had not been there before. A few passengers exchanged quiet whispers, curious about the sudden shift in behavior. Some speculated about why the crew was treating her differently, but none of them dared to ask directly. The businessman across the aisle quietly searched her name on his phone. His expression changed as he recognized the name. The quiet woman he had been speaking to, the one who had seemed modest and unassuming, was in fact one of the most powerful business leaders he had ever read about. His curiosity grew even stronger. He watched her carefully, noting the same calm composure, the same quiet dignity, and the same subtle authority he had observed earlier. She continued to write in her notebook, occasionally sipping her water. Her pen moved smoothly, words carefully chosen and placed on the page. She paused frequently, looking up at the cabin and then at the view outside the window. There was a sense of mindfulness in her actions, a calm awareness of the people and the environment around her. The flight attendants, now aware of her true identity, made small adjustments to their service. They ensured her meals were prepared exactly to her preference, offered drinks without hesitation, and responded promptly to any requests. They moved with confidence, but also with a quiet respect that had not been present earlier. One attendant, who had initially hesitated when offering champagne, felt a mix of relief and humility. She approached the woman's seat again, her voice soft and careful. "Please let me know if there is anything else you need." The woman looked up, smiling gently. "Thank you. Everything is perfect." Her words were calm, unassuming, but carried a subtle authority that left the attendant with a sense of awe. Passengers began to take note of the change in demeanor among the crew. Some whispered quietly to each other, speculating about the woman's identity and wondering why the service had suddenly improved. A few glanced at her notebook, curious about what she might be writing, though no one dared to ask directly. Outside, the plane continued to glide smoothly through the sky. Clouds passed below like soft cotton, rivers and cities shrinking into miniature landscapes. The woman occasionally glanced out the window, taking in the view with quiet contemplation, then returned to her notes. Her presence seemed to calm the cabin subtly, creating a serene atmosphere amid the hum of the engines and the soft conversations of passengers. Hours into the flight, a sense of anticipation quietly built among the crew. They had realized they were serving someone whose decisions affected thousands of people and whose company held significant influence in the airline industry. The earlier moment of hesitation, the brief uncertainty about offering champagne, now felt like a small but important lesson in awareness and respect. The businessman across the aisle continued to observe quietly. He had initially seen her as just another passenger, modest and unassuming, but now he realized she carried an extraordinary presence. He marveled at her composure, her ability to remain calm and attentive without drawing attention to herself, and her subtle awareness of the people around her. Throughout the cabin, the atmosphere was transformed by this quiet recognition. Crew members moved with more care, passengers observed more thoughtfully, and small gestures of politeness and attention multiplied. The woman by the window did not command attention through words or actions, but her presence alone had altered the energy in the first-class cabin. She continued to write in her notebook, sometimes pausing to sip water, sometimes looking up at the cabin, sometimes gazing out the window. She remained fully present, fully composed, and entirely unassuming. There was no arrogance, no demand for special treatment, only quiet authority and calm observation. The flight continued over vast landscapes, crossing time zones and cities, while the woman remained a quiet center of attention without seeking it. Her patience and composure had already begun to leave a lasting impression on those around her. A subtle but powerful reminder of the importance of respect, awareness, and humility. By the time the cabin lights dimmed for rest, the crew and passengers alike had a new perspective. The small moments of hesitation and doubt earlier in the flight had given way to careful observation, thoughtful service, and quiet admiration. Everyone who noticed her presence understood, in some way, that she was remarkable, not because of status or appearance, but because of the calm, quiet authority she carried effortlessly. And as the plane continued its journey across the sky, the woman by the window remained a silent observer, shaping the experience of everyone around her, leaving impressions that would last far beyond the flight itself. Her story, though still unfolding, had already begun to teach lessons about patience, dignity, and respect. Lessons that would resonate with the crew, the passengers, and anyone who quietly noticed the way she carried herself through a simple, unassuming flight in first class. The flight had passed its midpoint, and the cabin settled into a calm rhythm. Outside, the sky was painted in shades of blue, with clouds drifting like soft islands below. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers had adjusted to the long hours. Some slept lightly, others worked quietly on laptops, and a few stared out the window, lost in thought. The hum of the engines was steady, creating a gentle, almost meditative background noise. The woman near the window remained composed, her notebook open on the tray table. She occasionally sipped her water or glanced at the sky, watching the clouds move slowly beneath the plane. Her pen moved with careful precision, her handwriting neat and deliberate. Each word seemed to reflect thoughtfulness, a quiet reflection of her observations from the flight and from the world around her. Meanwhile, the cabin crew had taken notice of the subtle ways in which the passenger influenced the atmosphere. The earlier hesitation when offering champagne had already been replaced with careful attentiveness. The attendants now moved with clear respect, but not in an obsequious way. They treated her politely, efficiently, and with genuine care, ensuring she had everything she needed while maintaining the professional balance expected of first-class service. One of the senior attendants approached another crew member quietly. "Do you realize who she is?" she whispered, glancing at the woman. Her voice was low, meant only for the ears of her colleague. The other attendant leaned closer, eyes widening. "Wait, are you saying what I think you're saying?" The senior attendant nodded. "She's the CEO of one of our largest corporate clients. The contracts she manages are worth millions for this airline every year." A sudden wave of awareness spread among the crew. Their minds replayed the earlier moments, the slight hesitation, the question about something simpler instead of champagne. A flush of embarrassment touched their faces. How could they have treated her differently without knowing? They had assumed, as people often do, based on appearances alone. The woman, however, remained unaware of the silent conversations she had sparked. She continued to write, her calm presence uninterrupted by the realization that her identity had been discovered. Her composure was remarkable. She did not need acknowledgement, she did not demand special treatment, and she did not comment on the subtle shift in attention from the attendants. Passengers began to notice small changes as well. The older woman sitting a few rows back whispered to the person beside her, curiosity evident in her tone. "Did you see how the crew's behavior changed? They suddenly seem very attentive." The person she was speaking to nodded quietly. "I noticed that too. There's something about her, I don't know exactly what, but it's clear she's someone important." The woman herself paid no attention to these observations. She had learned long ago that quiet presence and calm composure spoke louder than words. She continued writing in her notebook, occasionally glancing at the cabin, occasionally looking out at the passing clouds. Her focus was on the small details, the behavior of people, the patterns in their interactions, and the subtle lessons that could be drawn from them. The businessman across the aisle, who had recognized her identity earlier, leaned back in his seat with a mixture of admiration and surprise. He had initially thought she was just another passenger, modest and unassuming, but now he realized she carried an extraordinary presence. She did not boast, she did not seek attention, and yet every action, every small gesture, radiated a quiet authority that was impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the senior attendant decided to approach her again, this time with a slightly more personal touch. "Is there anything else I can bring you?" she asked softly. "We want to make sure everything is perfect for you." The woman looked up, smiling politely. "Thank you. Everything is wonderful. I appreciate your care." Her words were simple but carried a weight that left the attendant reflecting on their own behavior. It was a gentle reminder that respect and attentiveness should not depend on assumptions, appearances, or titles. The woman had managed to teach an important lesson without saying much at all. As the hours passed, the conversation among passengers subtly shifted. The businessman across the aisle quietly shared his realization with a few nearby passengers, careful not to disturb the calm of the cabin. Whispers spread slowly, revealing the quiet truth. The modest, unassuming woman they had been speaking to and observing was in fact a powerful CEO with influence over thousands of people. The knowledge changed how passengers interacted, even in small ways. Some became more polite, others more thoughtful in their speech, and several took extra care when addressing attendants or fellow passengers. The influence of her presence was undeniable. It was not fear or intimidation, but the recognition of quiet authority, humility, and composed confidence. The woman continued her work, pen moving steadily across the page, as she observed the human behavior around her. She noted the interactions between passengers, the attentiveness of the crew, and the subtle ways in which respect and recognition unfolded. She did not judge or lecture. She simply noticed, recorded, and allowed her presence to quietly impact the people around her. The flight attendants moved with efficiency and grace, attending to each request promptly. The earlier hesitation and uncertainty had completely vanished. Each action they took was thoughtful, precise, and respectful. They offered water refills, adjusted seating comfort, and responded to minor requests with care. The subtle shift in service was noticeable to anyone paying attention, a quiet acknowledgement of the woman's presence and influence. Passengers who had previously ignored the woman began to look at her with newfound awareness. A young professional traveling for work leaned forward slightly, trying to catch a glimpse of her notebook, curious about what she might be writing. A couple nearby exchanged whispers about how she carried herself, noting the calm authority in her every movement. Even the older woman from a few rows back reflected on how observing someone quietly could reveal so much about character and presence. The businessman across the aisle continued to observe quietly, thinking about the lessons he could take from this flight. He had assumed that power and influence came with loud announcements, visible wealth, or assertive speech. But she had shown him otherwise. Influence could be quiet, subtle, and deeply rooted in composure, patience, and attentiveness. At one point, the senior attendant approached her again, this time with a gentle suggestion. "If there is anything you need, please do not hesitate to ask. We are happy to assist." The woman looked up, smiling faintly. "Thank you. I have everything I need. Your care is very much appreciated." Her words were calm, polite, and unassuming. She did not expect recognition. She did not demand attention. But her response carried a quiet authority that left the attendant reflecting on the importance of awareness, respect, and humility in their work. As the flight continued, the cabin remained calm and serene. The woman by the window remained a steady presence, quietly influencing the behavior of those around her without speaking loudly or drawing attention to herself. Her calm observation, patience, and quiet authority had already begun to shape the environment in the first-class cabin. Passengers observed, attendants responded, and the subtle energy in the cabin shifted. People began to treat each other with more respect, speak more thoughtfully, and carry themselves with a bit more awareness. It was a silent ripple effect, all caused by the quiet presence of one composed and observant individual. Hours passed as the plane crossed cities, rivers, and mountains. The woman continued to write, occasionally sipping her water and occasionally looking out the window. Her calm composure never wavered. She did not seek attention, she did not boast, and she did not demand recognition. Her influence was felt silently, gently, and profoundly. Passengers whispered quietly to one another, reflecting on what they had learned from observing her. Crew members moved with confidence and attentiveness, aware of the subtle lessons the woman had provided without saying a word. Even the businessman across the aisle had begun to take notes mentally, thinking about how patience, humility, and composed presence could carry influence greater than loud words or displays of power. As the cabin lights dimmed to prepare passengers for rest, the woman's presence continued to anchor the space. Her calm authority, quiet observation, and attentive nature had already made an impression that would last long after the flight ended. And in that quiet, unassuming way, she had managed to teach a powerful lesson about respect, patience, humility, and the subtle ways in which influence could be expressed. She had done it not through loud words or demanding behavior, but through simple, composed presence, reminding everyone that true authority often speaks quietly and leaves lasting impressions without needing to announce itself. The rest of the flight passed in a serene rhythm. The clouds drifted slowly below, the engines hummed steadily, and the passengers settled into a quiet awareness of their surroundings. The woman by the window remained a calm, composed observer, leaving an invisible, yet powerful mark on the cabin, shaping the experience of everyone around her without ever needing to raise her voice. By the time the plane began its descent, the subtle transformations in attitude and awareness among passengers and crew alike were evident. People moved with more care, spoke with more thoughtfulness, and treated each interaction as meaningful. The quiet, composed passenger had left a mark not through words, but through presence, observation, and calm dignity. A mark that would stay with those who noticed it for a long time. The plane had begun its final descent, and outside the windows, the clouds were thinner, allowing glimpses of the land below. The cities stretched out, roads winding like ribbons, rivers glinting in the sunlight. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers were stirring, adjusting their seats, fastening seatbelts, and preparing for landing. There was a quiet anticipation in the air. The woman by the window remained calm, her notebook closed now, resting on the tray table. She took a deep breath and looked around the cabin, observing the passengers and crew as they prepared for the end of the flight. She noticed the small gestures of courtesy, the polite interactions, and the subtle attentiveness that had developed over the hours. It was a quiet but meaningful reminder of the impact a composed presence could have on others. The businessman across the aisle, who had been observing her since early in the flight, leaned back in his seat, still processing what he had learned. He had initially assumed she was a modest, ordinary traveler, but now he knew her true identity. He thought about the way she had carried herself, calm and unassuming, yet commanding respect simply through presence and behavior. He realized that influence did not need to be loud or forceful. It could be quiet, thoughtful, and profoundly effective. Several of the first-class passengers who had noticed the subtle changes in the crew's behavior now began to whisper among themselves. The news had spread quietly. The woman who had been so composed and observant was the CEO of a major company, one whose decisions affected thousands of employees and significant contracts for the airline. There was a shared sense of awe and curiosity. Some felt embarrassed at having judged her by her appearance earlier, while others reflected on the power of quiet authority and humility. The senior flight attendant approached her seat one last time before landing. Her voice was soft, respectful, and sincere. "Thank you for flying with us today. Please let me know if there is anything more we can do for you." The woman looked up, her expression calm and gracious. "Thank you. Everything has been wonderful. I appreciate your care and attention." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. They conveyed gratitude without expectation, respect without demand. The attendant nodded, visibly relieved and humbled by the encounter. She returned to her duties, carrying a newfound understanding of the subtle power of respect and observation. Passengers continued to prepare for landing. Some stretched lightly, others adjusted their belongings, and a few reflected quietly on the flight experience. The woman remained composed, taking a moment to glance out the window, watching the landscape grow clearer with each passing minute. There was a sense of mindfulness in her gaze, a calm awareness of the moment and the people around her. The businessman across the aisle couldn't help but speak softly to her one final time. "I have to say, it's been remarkable to watch you carry yourself on this flight. Calm, observant, and unassuming. I've learned more from just watching than I could have imagined." She smiled gently, her eyes meeting his. "I believe everyone has something to teach, if we are willing to pay attention. Observation and patience often reveal more than words." Her response was thoughtful, yet delivered with humility. It left the businessman reflecting on his own behavior and the lessons he had observed throughout the flight. He realized that authority, respect, and influence were not measured by status or appearance, but by composure, patience, and the way a person treated others. Meanwhile, other passengers had started to notice the quiet exchange. The whispers continued, respectful and curious. Some reflected on their own assumptions and biases, thinking about how easy it was to misjudge someone based on appearance alone. Others quietly admired her poise and the understated way she had influenced the cabin without making a scene or demanding attention. The flight attendants moved with efficiency, ensuring everyone was secure for landing. Their attention to detail had improved noticeably over the course of the journey. They responded promptly to minor requests, maintained a courteous and professional demeanor, and exhibited a quiet confidence that had grown as a result of their recognition of the woman's presence. The woman observed all of this without comment. She did not seek acknowledgement, nor did she seem to expect it. Her presence alone had shaped the behavior of those around her, and she remained serene, grounded, and fully aware of the small details that made the flight experience meaningful for others. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the passengers remained calm in their seats, some exchanging small smiles and quiet comments about the flight. The woman adjusted her seat, gathered her belongings, and stood, ready to leave the aircraft. She moved with deliberate grace, her presence calm but unmistakable. Several crew members approached as she stood, offering assistance and polite farewells. Their demeanor was warm, respectful, and sincere. "Thank you for flying with us. We hope you had a pleasant journey," one said. The woman nodded, smiling gently. "It was a wonderful flight. Thank you for your care." Her words, calm and unassuming, left a lasting impression. The attendants felt a quiet pride in their work, humbled by the opportunity to serve someone who exemplified respect, patience, and composure so effortlessly. Passengers who had noticed her throughout the flight reflected on the subtle lessons she had imparted without ever speaking loudly. They thought about the importance of humility, attentiveness, and the quiet strength of composed presence. Some felt inspired to treat others with more consideration in their own lives, remembering how her calm demeanor had influenced the cabin. The woman made her way down the aisle, her movements deliberate but unhurried. Passengers turned slightly to observe her, curious and respectful. There was no sense of arrogance, no need for recognition, only a quiet dignity that radiated naturally. As she exited the plane and walked toward the terminal, she blended seamlessly into the crowd. Her presence remained unassuming, yet the impact of her calm composure and patient observation lingered behind her. Crew members returned to their duties with renewed awareness, and passengers reflected on the subtle lessons of the journey. The woman paused briefly in the terminal, taking a deep breath and allowing herself a quiet moment of reflection. She had observed, she had learned, and she had influenced others simply by being attentive, composed, and present. The lessons she carried were not just for herself but for anyone willing to notice the small details of human behavior, respect, and patience. Passengers who had quietly observed her throughout the flight began to share their reflections with one another. Some talked about how they had judged too quickly based on appearances. Others reflected on the subtle influence of patience and humility in leadership. The story of the flight began to circulate quietly, a reminder that true authority often speaks without words, and that the quietest person in the room can leave the deepest impression. The flight attendants, too, carried the lesson forward. They had learned that respect and attentiveness should never depend on assumptions or appearances. The simple act of treating every passenger with care and dignity was a reflection of professionalism and humanity. They would remember the composed woman by the window and the quiet impact she had made on their understanding of service, observation, and awareness. As the terminal filled with the bustle of arrivals, the woman walked calmly through the crowd. She carried herself with quiet confidence, unassuming yet unmistakably present. She did not need to announce her status or influence. Her composure and attentiveness spoke louder than any words could. Passengers and crew alike reflected on the flight as they went about their day. Some quietly acknowledged the power of humility and composure. Others thought about the small gestures that could leave lasting impressions on those around them. The influence of the woman's presence lingered, a subtle but powerful reminder of the lessons she had imparted without ever speaking loudly or demanding attention. The journey had ended, but its impact remained. The calm composure, quiet authority, and attentive presence of one passenger had transformed the atmosphere of the cabin, leaving impressions that would last far beyond a single flight. Passengers remembered her as someone remarkable not because of status or wealth, but because of patience, humility, and the quiet power of observation. As she disappeared into the terminal crowd, She remained serene, composed, and fully present in the moment. The passengers, crew, and even casual observers carried with them the memory of her presence. A lesson in dignity, patience, respect, and quiet leadership. It was a story that would quietly inspire those who noticed, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful influence is the one that is felt, not announced. And so the journey ended, not with loud declarations, but with quiet understanding. The woman by the window had left an indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed her presence, showing that true authority and respect are earned not through appearances or words, but through composure, patience, and the thoughtful observation of the world and people around us.